1050 and 1051 of the Gotovine defense final brief. Because those prosecution arguments were discredited during trial and during the cross-examination of General Jones, the prosecution now advances new arguments concerning necessary and reasonable measures that were never advanced at trial. For the record, we object to these new arguments being raised for the first time in final arguments and final briefs, denying the trial chamber and General Gotovine the opportunity to challenge those theories, to cross-examine witnesses on them, to put its own witnesses on to rebut those claims. The time to advance the arguments the prosecution is advancing now was when a three-star U.S. general testified that General Gotovine took all necessary and reasonable measures. That was the time to confront General Jones and General Gotovine, because then those new theories could be tested. Because the trial chamber cannot test the new theories advanced by the prosecution, should be afforded no weight. What you should rely on is the expert testimony of General Jones and contrast it with the case the prosecution put to him in cross-examination. You should not rely on the bald opinions of prosecution trial counsel on what necessary and reasonable measures would have been. On the issue of effective control, first, Your Honors, let me preface this by saying, in the entire discussion yesterday about necessary and reasonable measures, effective control, notice, you were again never told what the burden of proof is, and never told whether the analysis you were being put forward, or that was being put forward, was being measured against the burden of proof. As the Chamber is aware, the Appeals Chamber has ruled that with respect to each element of command responsibility, the prosecution must prove its case beyond reasonable doubt. That means you must conclude that there is no reasonable interpretation of the evidence other than that General Gotovine had effective control, other than that he had notice, and other than that he failed to take necessary and reasonable measures. Now, with respect to the issue of effective control, the trial chamber specifically asked the prosecution to address the commentary to Article 87 of the Protocol of the Geneva Convention. That provision says it is self-evident that the obligation applies in the context of the responsibilities as they have devolved over different levels of the hierarchy, and that the duties of the non-commissioned officer are not identical to those of a battalion commander, and the duties of the latter are not identical to those of the divisional commander. Now, despite the trial chamber specifically asking the prosecution to address this issue, in essence, you were told yesterday the commentary is irrelevant. You were never told what, in the context of this case, it means that the obligation applies as the responsibilities devolve over different levels of the hierarchy. The prosecution remains of the view General Gotovine, at the top of the chain of command, should have taken the measures that an NCO at the bottom of the chain of command would take. Moreover, we dispute the prosecution's claim that we have somehow misstated the Orich Appeals Chamber decision. We quoted it verbatim in a block quote from a brief. The prosecution left out this portion of the Appeals Chamber's finding. Quote, the separate question of whether, due to proximity or remoteness of control, the superior indeed possessed effective control is a matter of evidence, not substantive law. That's at paragraph 618 of our brief. That's the issue we raised. The prosecution doesn't respond. With respect to the issue of Grahovo, General Jones testified that prior to storm, General Gotovine took all necessary and reasonable measures after the Grahovo operation to prevent and punish crime. The prosecution offered no expert testimony to contradict General Jones's opinion. Moreover, the prosecution ignores the context in which General Gotovine was operating after the Grahovo operation, but prior to Operation Storm. For example, the prosecution completely ignores Operation Vagaj and the fact that the Croatian leadership was aware that Serbs were planning an attack by forces under Ratko Mladić's command against General Gotovine's forces in the Grahovo-Glamoch area, which turned out to be true because the VRS Drina Corps arrived in the Grahovo area on the 9th of August. It is within that context, General Gotovine facing an imminent threat, that he was forced to take the measures that were reasonable in those circumstances. The prosecution falsely claims at paragraph 151, and again in its argument yesterday, that, quote, General Gotovine took steps to conceal his subordinates' crimes at Grahovo, close quote, by ordering that, quote, report through a messenger that Glamoch and Grahovo were shelled by phosphoric shells, close quote. The prosecution, of course, ignores the fact that what General Gotovine said was the truth. In fact, the wider areas of Grahovo and Glamoch, i.e. the forested areas, were shelled by phosphoric shells by the HV. That's Exhibit D, 1980. And indeed, Ratko Mladić, in his diary on the 2nd of August, referenced incendiary munitions. That's D, 1465, E-Court page 243. Accordingly, the prosecution condemns General Gotovine for reporting the truth. Next, the prosecution argues that General Gotovine somehow is responsible because troops under his command had suffered in the 4.5 prior years at the hands of the Serbian JCE. Therefore, they were prone to revenge. Your Honors, virtually everyone in Croatia had suffered some injustice during the war in Croatia, from Vukovar and Ilok in the east, all the way to Dubrovnik and Prevlaka in the far south. In theory, virtually every Croatian could have had a motive for revenge. The prosecution argues that it does not dispute Croatia's right to retake its lands. It just disputes Croatia's right to use Croatians to do it. On the issue of necessary and reasonable measures, we have said all along that General Gotovine took necessary and reasonable measures to prevent and punish crime. Look at the evidence, Your Honors. General Gotovine was there when Minister Šušak passed on the U.S. conditions on the 2nd of August to the entire military leadership. Again, a private conversation, a state secret conversation, which included that military district commanders were to pass on orders to prevent, quote, any kind of uncontrolled conduct, torching, looting, etc., close quote. That's Exhibit D, 409. As Laušić testified, Šušak also ordered that measures be taken to prevent any behavior that would require soldiers to be brought before a court. That's transcript 15166, lines 14 to 22. Yet OTP says at paragraph 16 of its brief that Šušak's order, which was given in private to the top officials of the military, was essentially a pretend order, quote, aimed at avoiding liability for the crimes rather than genuinely preventing them, close quote. The prosecution, of course, fails to identify who Šušak was allegedly pretending to. nor is there any evidence in the record in the form of witness testimony, presidential transcript, and the like to support OTP's inference that Minister Shushak's order was intended to be followed. Again, Your Honors, the Gotovine defense says that when Minister Shushak ordered that, quote, any kind of uncontrolled conduct, including torching and looting, were to be prevented, that's what he meant. The prosecution says when Shushak privately told the military leadership to prevent looting and torching, he meant allow looting and torching. General Gotovine issued explicit orders prior to storm that all criminal activity was to be eliminated. Consistent with the U.S. conditions and Shushak instructions, General Gotovine issued the order at Exhibit D-201, page 2. Here's what he ordered, quote, familiarizing units with the need to eliminate all negative occurrence that will surface in the course of combat operations, with a focus on preventing torching and destruction of larger populated areas and towns. Now, even though General Gotovine ordered the elimination of all negative occurrences, the prosecution argues that this order meant that units should protect populated areas, but General Gotovine wanted them to burn down rural areas. You can see paragraphs 156 and 157 of the prosecution's final brief. The second sentence there, the political activities plan attachment indicates that Gotovine and Split MD Command expected burning and destruction to occur and accepted the anticipated destruction of rural areas. Consistent with those instructions and with the JCE members' focus on quickly colonizing the larger towns in the Krajina with Croats, Croatian forces left the larger towns relatively intact, but devastated rural areas in Sector South. Herein lies another fundamental contradiction in the prosecution's case. The prosecution doesn't argue that General Gotovine was issuing weak, repetitive, ineffective orders. They do that later when they try to discredit General Gotovine. They're arguing here that General Gotovine issued an effective order. That General Gotovine issued an order to protect the larger towns, and that order was implemented. But that General Gotovine deliberately failed to mention rural areas, thereby signaling to his subordinates that he wanted them burned down. Again, the prosecution is alleging that General Gotovine issued effective orders prior to storm. I ask you, Your Honors, is this interpretation by the prosecution the only reasonable interpretation of this order? This is nonsense. We say that when General Gotovine ordered the elimination of all negative occurrences, he meant eliminate all negative occurrences. The prosecution argues that it means, I order you to burn down rural areas. Once again, they never put this interpretation of this order to anyone, nor is there any evidence in the record to support their interpretation. Not in Tunin's suggested. But in their blind zeal to obtain a conviction, the prosecution would rather argue the ridiculous than concede an obvious point. Further on in D-201, at page 2, General Gotovine orders advising members of units on conduct with civilians and POWs in accordance with the Geneva Conventions. Now, what the prosecution claims is a boilerplate order, in fact put into practice. In paragraph 125, the prosecution calls it a generic reference to the Geneva Convention that was, quote, manifestly inadequate. Apparently, General Gotovine, according to the prosecution, should have itemized what Croatian forces shouldn't do. Don't kill, don't burn, don't loot, don't torture. They never put this claim to any witness. But you heard that this order was implemented. You heard that booklets were handed out